Well, thank you. Well, look, this is a real honor for us to be able to talk about a very powerful topic, and we actually have a very powerful panel. So before I introduce the panel, I just want to set up some context. We're at the confluence of some very powerful forces, and those forces should be unleashing a clean energy revolution. So force number one, there's a clear recognition that climate change is affecting the way we live, the way we work, the air we breathe, the water we drink. Climatic events most recently are helping to raise awareness that we have a fundamental challenge, a global challenge. Second key force is the fact that despite all the challenges in the economy, we are awash in liquidity, awash in capital. And it's going to many different investments all over the world. Another key force is clean energy technology is not on the drawing board. It's here, it's now, it's commercially viable, and it's a growing part of our energy economy. So one of the fundamental questions that we're trying to ask ourselves, what's it going to take to unleash the full potential of renewable energy? What's it going to take to fundamentally reverse, if we can, the effects of climate change? What are the myths? What are the barriers? What are the fundamental challenges or the new ideas and opportunities that we can potentially unleash to help drive a fundamental change in our lives, in our economy, and our future? So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, Dr. Kristina Johnson, CEO of Enduring Hydro. This is a company that helps to modernize hydroelectric facilities. She's also the former Undersecretary of Energy, the U.S. Department of Energy. We also have Michael Levy, the Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council of Foreign Relations, and the author of his most recent book, The Power Surge. Great read. I encourage you to buy it. It's actually at the bookstore, right?
It is.
All right.
Mick Sawka. Mick Sawka has a job I think I would really love to have. He's Director of Business Development at Harvard University. And he's got a really cool job because what he gets to do is take the coolest inventions and the best science and help drive it into commercial reality. Help unleash the commercial potential of basic science in a number of areas. And we're also joined by Jeff Logan, Senior Energy Analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab. Jeff focuses on energy policy, the interaction of natural gas and renewable energy sources, and he's actually he's lived and worked often in China and has some really cool experiences and point of view about China, which is also a fundamental and relevant part of the discussion around renewable energy in the world. And so, just by way of introduction, my name is Chris, and I run a business at Thomson Reuters called Intellectual Property and Science. And what we do is we study scientific literature. We study the world's patents. And what we try to do is figure out what are the early indicators of scientific discovery and development. And as it relates to things like clean energy, what we look at are, who are the countries that are actually driving scientific discovery in renewable energy? What are the actual trends in one particular area of renewable energy versus the other? What's the pace of investment? What is essentially the technological underpinning of technology and innovation and invention when it comes to this particular area of clean energy? So without any further delay, what I thought I'd do is start the conversation with Kristina to give us a fact base, a grounding in the fundamental parameters of energy, global warming, and the energy economy. So with that, Kristina.
Thanks, Chris. And so we had a big announcement this week from the President of the United States, and in that announcement, the President talked about what are some of the key indicators or facts, as he also said in his speech, that would show that humans have a profound influence on climate change. So one of the statistics he mentioned was the last 12 of the 12 warmest years on record, are 12 of the last 15 years. We've heard a lot about the Arctic continent has shrunk to its smallest size so that we now have a Northwest Passage. There's a state very nearby, I grew up in Colorado, but another state I spent a lot of time with is Montana. There's a park there called Glacier Park. Since it was named 100 years ago, half of the glaciers have melted, and they suspect in the next 10 years they'll all be gone. So I don't know if we'll have to rename it Glacierless National Park, which would be a shame. But that's going to happen in a very short period of time. So when we think about this, we were talking a little bit before the panel, and I Googled how many Americans believe that human action is behind climate change. And it's somewhere between 50 to 70%, depending on what poll you think. So if you happen to be in the 30 to 50% that aren't sure or don't think so, that's, I think, part of our culture's prospect of how to deal with risk. But I would say if you don't think climate change is real, and you're willing to take the chance that 50% it may be real or not, imagine playing Russian roulette with 3 bolts in the chamber. And I'm not willing to do that. So I think that climate change is real from human action, and I'd like to see us make some efforts towards mitigating that. So just a couple of other facts. What's the demand in the US for energy? Well, about 30% is from transportation. Almost all of that is petroleum-based. About 30% is from industry, industrial processes, and the other 40% is from buildings, commercial, residential. Now, if we think about just electrical sources, 20% in this country is from nuclear. 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear. About 12% come from renewables. The majority of that is hydro. Hydro is 60% of our renewable energy in this country. And then about 68% are from natural gas and coal. So to rebalance that to something that would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 42% by 2030, which is one of the president's goals, or 83% of the 2005 levels by 2050, we need to rebalance. And one of the studies that we did would say that we need about 30% nuclear from 20%. We need about 33% renewables from 12%. And we need to reduce 68% down to about 30%, of which half is gas, half is carbon capture and sequestration for gas and coal, and the other half could be the cleanest type coal plants that don't necessarily capture and reuse or sequester CO2. So I think we've got a big challenge. And if you think, well, a lot has been said about natural gas. I think natural gas is a good bridge to the future. I think we have to think, though, in terms of, we had a discussion about when we talk about powering tomorrow, what tomorrow are we talking about? So everybody would say that natural gas could last for 100 or 200 years, coal for less than 100 years. Now, when you think about that in terms of the time that humans have occupied the Earth, I saw one place where if you were a 6-foot-tall person, the amount of, and that was relative to the life of the planet, then the time that humans have occupied the planet could be measured by one nail file filing across one pinky nail. That's how long we've been here. And we've been here millions of years. If you think about what 100 years or 200 years in terms of our energy future looks like, it's not very long. The last thing is a personal side, and someone always told me, facts are fine, Chris, but it's really a story that grabs people. So when I think about the future of 200 years not having natural gas or coal, I think about my family. My great-grandfather was born in 1803. That's 200 years ago. There's only 200 years in 3 generations of my family. So it's very personal that I'd like my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who may be alive when natural gas runs out and coal runs out, to have access to energy.
Any more facts? Any more facts, myths, to debunk, to set the stage for the challenge that we face?
Well, there are plenty of facts and more than enough myths in this space to debunk. But let me just pick up on the last part of what Kristina talked about, because there are a variety of different timescales you need to be thinking about, and I think are useful when you frame thinking about energy and climate. So we have this enormous scale of geologic history, a much smaller scale of human history, and then within that, this 100 or 200 or more, but not necessarily that much more, potential for fossil fuels. When it comes to climate change, the challenge is over a much shorter timescale, or at least begins over a much shorter timescale, and then extends over a longer period. We could go on coal and gas and oil for a substantial period of time and cook ourselves in the process. Our problem right now is more about abundance and managing abundance than it is about scarcity, at least when it comes to climate change. The other timescale issue I would put out there on climate is that the decisions we make today are going to have impacts not just tomorrow and not just 5 years from now, but decades and centuries, and not just because the impact of greenhouse gas emissions plays out over a long time, but because the facilities we build today will be around for a long time. We keep our cars on the road for about 15 years. Our power plants stick around 40, 50, 60. Our buildings, 100 or more years. So the decisions we make today in what to put out there really play out over a much longer time. We have to be thinking about the impacts that they'll have 40, 50, 60 or more years from now.
Good point.
Yeah, I guess one more fact to bring up is there's a lot of news recently about E15 versus E10 and ethanol going into the gasoline chain. And if you just take a look at Brazil, it's a country that in the 1970s made a policy decision to switch away from gasoline, and the majority of the cars there can operate on either gasoline or ethanol or switch back and forth, whichever one's more economical at the pump. So when you hear these arguments that you can't make vehicles that can run on ethanol because it's going to eat away at the tubing or the rubber or the components, it can be done. It's just a matter of having the will to do it.
And I'll make one or two additional points about what the president announced last week and what role natural gas could play in helping to reduce our emissions, at least over the near term. I think people have been, beaten to death almost with this, the idea of the shale revolution occurring, and natural gas prices are very low, and we're kind of set for the future. And if you look at the past 5 years, with abundance of natural gas and relatively low prices, the power sector in the United States has reduced its carbon dioxide emissions by about 12 or 13%. And that's certainly tremendous progress. And that occurred because power plants shifted from burning coal to burning more natural gas. And there's a carbon benefit of doing that. And so at the peak, in the middle of last year, in the middle of 2012, gas prices were at a very, very low level, at roughly $2 a million BTUs. Since then, however, gas prices have climbed back up, and we're in this process of discovering a new equilibrium price for natural gas based on hydraulic fracturing and the other ways that we get gas. So today, gas is at, I believe, $3.55 or something like that, almost twice what it was at the low point last year. And all those power generators are now beginning to shift back to coal. So there's going to be quite a challenge to accomplish the president's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 17% from the 2005 level in the year 2020. We're going to need to do more. A lot of renewables, for example, have been growing very strongly for the past few years in the United States. Last year was a record year for installing wind and photovoltaics in the United States. This year, it's probably going to be a little bit different. The wind industry is not looking as strong. The photovoltaic industry is still growing very rapidly, and we're expecting strong growth there. But I'll stop there with just those points about how the power sector has been changing in the past few years and what role gas and renewables have played in it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the wind, solar, natural gas, because I think there's a couple topics wrapped in there. One is, if natural gas is abundant and is relatively low priced, does that snuff out clean energy revolution? So, is there a compatibility between those two? And I guess the second question is, solar, wind. I mean, these are very different technologies. And when we do our analysis and we do patent landscaping, what we see is a significant increase in the pace and scope and breadth of development around solar. And because they're using nanotechnology, thin materials, different chemical compounds, and in many respects, sort of, creating an outlook that potentially solar tracks towards, similar to semiconductors, where you get, smaller size, greater power, production at a pace that, opens up so many new potential innovations. So when you look at the trade-offs between these two among all of these technologies, where do you see sort of the opportunity or the challenge, and are they compatible?
Well, maybe just one fact in terms of, for every dollar per million BTU, that translates to between $7 and $8 per megawatt hour. So when natural gas goes down to $2, that means the kind of power purchase agreements you can get for new build drop from 4 to 2. That means they're going to drop by $15 to $20. Well, that's a lot. And then that makes new build very difficult. And we just saw that in the PJM market, Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, that have a capacity market. We signed a power purchase agreement at $136 per megawatt day. A few weeks later, the auction, which is a 3-year auction, dropped to $59. So if that would have happened before we signed it, we wouldn't have been able to build. So it's, the markets are very dynamic right now, and very dynamic regionally as well. So it's just from a trade-off of how gas affects renewables, which are being built and are being built up. I think that's one thing. The other thing is the policy. You're absolutely right that Jeff, that we've had a lot of deployment of wind and solar, and I think a lot of that came from the Recovery Act and the production tax credits and the cash grants in lieu of production tax credits and investment tax credits. We need to have a consistent policy. Solar has that extended out to 2017. Wind expired, hydro expired, and so now we got extended for another year, but it takes time to build, so people are cautious.
Let me pick up a bit on this question of gas versus wind versus solar. The first thing, when I think about the viability of renewables in the face of gas, in the face of other challenges, I look at three big areas of uncertainty. The first is technology, the second is policy, and the third is the price of the competitor of natural gas. And if you look at the Department of Energy's modeling exercises, and any modeling exercise should be taken with a huge grain of salt, but they tend to show that the uncertainty in technology costs and the uncertainty in policy are much more consequential than the potential differences that we might see in natural gas prices, in part because if natural gas were really expensive, these technologies would, loosely speaking, be competing against still pretty cheap coal. Yeah. So that puts a boundary on how much gas can really undercut them. The second piece, and I think this is important, is that if we were to adopt broad-based policy to penalize greenhouse gas emissions because of the damage that they cause, it would benefit both gas and renewable energy. So from a policy standpoint and from a political standpoint, we would benefit if we had these different factions seeing things a little bit less as a zero-sum game, and they don't all see it as a zero-sum game, but a little bit less that way, a little bit more seeing what are the steps we could all benefit from together.
Right. So would there need to be some sort of fundamental change in the economics of, to basically create a bit more of a level playing field? And, again, with whether it's credits, tax.
So there are all sorts of things you can do to get to a point. You can subsidize, and there are important ways that we have supported development of renewable energy technology. You need less mature technologies to come down the learning curve and be able to be competitive. Their competition in fossil fuels has had a very long head start. But I think over the long run, it's very difficult to subsidize across the board and get to the scale we need to deal with the climate challenge because, frankly, your success makes your policies too costly. Yeah. So in the long run, you do, I think, need to penalize things that cause damage if you want a fiscally sustainable way to get these technologies out into the field.
Right. And Mick, you've worked with a lot of companies on venture capital, private equity, and a lot of interesting and emerging areas. So is the financial community part of the solution to sort of drive and each of these particular components or categories of renewable energy?
No, the financial community community is, but I think it depends on both the time scale and the scale of investment. And so I was recently running a biofuels company, and part of the issue there is these are very capital-intensive, long-time horizon projects. So for example, to build one biofuels plant that may have the output of 20 to 30 million gallons of fuel, it can cost on the order of $100 to $200 million. Right. And the problem is the venture capital community is more used to investing in the science, which is needed, but not in that level of commitment to scale and build, to put steel on the ground. The private equity that has the money to do larger scale programs, they want it completely de-risked before they'll fund it. So they want zero risk. I guess a nice way to say it would be want to be first to be second. They want the first plant to be built completely running, and then they'll build the second one. And the government's done a good job of putting funding into basic research as well, but the government's not ultimately the one running the plant. So I guess going back to your first comment, there's money out there, but it's a matter of getting it in the right spot of the development chain at the right time and getting all these parties to work together, which they don't always do.
Right. So if you had $10 million to invest, where would you invest?
If I had $10 million to invest right now, I would invest in solar. And going to your point earlier about nanotechnology and development, and I'm somewhat biased representing Harvard at this point, but one of the initiatives at Harvard, because CO2 doesn't know any boundaries, and climate change doesn't know any boundaries. And one of the things Harvard is looking to do is, within the next 50 years, the population is probably going to add another 2 to 3 billion people who are going to need energy. So why not start them out on clean energy? And you're going to need to start them out on something at scale. They're not, in most of these countries, they're developing countries, they're not going to have natural gas, they're not going to have oil, they're not going to have coal. They may or may not have wind. But solar is something that they can have access to. It can scale very broadly. And so what Harvard is trying to do is a project called the First 100 Watts to get renewable energy to people who either don't have energy or they have a dirty source of energy. So if I had to invest right now, it would be in solar.
Can I pick up on something Mick said about financing? Because I think you're absolutely right that VCs will take technology risk, but they want a relatively quick return and a smaller scale of capital. There's a reason why solar matched up with the $10 million investment and maybe not with another scale. And private equity doesn't want the tech risk, but they have a little more patience and a little more money. So one of the things that we need to invent is not just new widgets, but new ways of financing innovation in energy technology that allow you to take these big risks over longer time scales and at larger scales of capital. And by the way, it's not only the energy sector that needs these kinds of new tools for financing innovation. One of the things that gives me a bit of heart in that is that venture capital didn't always exist. Venture capital was invented. If you went back to World War II era and you asked who's going to invent the kinds of things that we have in information technology today, they would have said the government, because that was the only player with that right mix of risk exposure and patience and all of this to make it happen. And you had 3 decades of attempts to make venture capital a real thing, to get it off the ground. It was basically invented in 1946. Didn't take off until really around 1980 when there was this confluence of technologies and a Department of Labor decision to allow pension investors to invest some of their money without being declared imprudent investors. And all of a sudden, you had a new model for financing innovation that we've had huge benefits from. Now, I don't know what that model is for energy and for this mix of different risks and different timescales, but that would be almost as important an invention as any particular widget that we could deploy.
I think that's right. I'm going to just pick up on that a little bit. Senator Coons from Delaware has a very important piece of legislation, master limited partnerships. So right now, 80% of what $400 billion is being invested in upstream oil and gas. What this would be called, it's the Master Limited Partnership Parity Act, which would open it up to renewable energy to also participate. And what that allows you to do is access the public market, but as a partnership so that you don't get taxed both at the corporate level and at the individual investor level. And that when you are taxed at the investor level, it's as a dividend. And I think this would be huge. This would allow folks with a lot of money and a lot of capital to put to work, to put it into renewables as much as they're putting it into oil and gas. So I think that's something. The other thing is there's a new company I just learned about in preparation for this panel, which is Solar Mosaic. And Dan Rosen, I think, is here. And that's sort of a marketplace where he'll put up projects in his company on a website. And if you want to invest in it, and they're solar right now, you can invest a little bit in this project and you get a guaranteed return over so many years. So I think we'll see more of that. It's small scale right now, but I'm hoping that those kinds of activities will scale.
So Jeff, I mean, you look at policy a lot, right? And so there's one of the things I think there's a recognition that there's a public-private partnership model that's got to work. But, so on the one hand, to make it, to unleash the commercial interests that can help drive this, I mean, what do you think are some of the policy decisions that can, again, change the balance of the equation so that it unleashes more activity and more result?
Well, I think if you want to have transformative impact, the first thing that you need is certainty. And you need to have clear rules of the road so that investors can put money where they want to put money and feel comfortable doing it. And we saw some of that occur with the Recovery Act from 2009. We saw a significant extension for incentives for wind power, for example. Mm-hmm. We had 4 or 5 years of very strong wind growth for the first time in this country. And we had other types of mechanisms and incentives available to help promote renewables. I think what's next on the agenda clearly is going to have to be some kind of a price on carbon or a limit on carbon that gives people the certainty that they need to make these investments that they won't otherwise make unless they have the right environment to do so. So I'm sure others will have additional points on that, and so I'll turn it over to them to add more to that.
Just all I would add is with, again, biofuels from that perspective, the renewable fuel standards, the U.S. has done a fantastic job of legislating the need for renewable fuels in the form of ethanol and mandating that use. But then every year they have the right to essentially eviscerate the penalties if the supply isn't there. And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg game. If the supply is not there, they don't want to penalize people. But if you don't penalize people, no one will invest. And so because the government has sort of both sides on this, in their defense, the oil industry is not being penalized, so they're not going to invest in new technologies. And the VC community is not going to put their money, as Jeff said, because there's no certainty that they're going to get a return, because there's no certainty they're going to get paid if the numbers keep changing.
So I'm going to pick on something that you had said, Mick. Global warming is global. It doesn't have any boundaries. And yet, we approach these things from a national government level. One of the things that we study is scientific research. And one of the things that we were noticing is that while China is a significant contributor of greenhouse gases, they're also a very significant and increasingly significant contributor to the body of science in terms of highly cited papers in the area of renewable energy. And so we're seeing countries are taking putting their investment and priorities differently when it comes to renewable energy. China, South Korea are significantly increasing their scientific output in the area. The U.S. is still, a very important contributor and player, but how do how should we be thinking about global warming? Because at the end of the day, we're constituencies of a certain country. We have certain, congressional and Senate representatives and government representatives, but they can't necessarily make it all happen around the world. So what breaks that sort of logjam, or how should we be thinking about it from a global perspective?
Yeah, I guess, you go back to what Kristina said in terms of the time scale. It's going to take time. It took 100 years to get the oil industry where it's at today. Right. Whether it's wind, solar, hydro, or biofuels, it's going to take 100 years. And there's going to be a lot of companies and a lot of innovation along the way. The U.S. still is the leading country in the world. So going back to the concept of focusing on a country specifically, there's plenty of opportunity for the U.S. to benefit from developing new technology, starting new companies, partnering with other people. Because again, no one country, no one company is going to do all of this. And so yes, from a purely US-centric perspective, there's plenty of opportunity working with Chinese companies or Danish companies or Indian companies to leverage their resources and make clean energy. So it doesn't necessarily have to be done in the US, but the US, to your point, I guess, can leverage its technological lead, which it still has. It's still the most creative country in the world. Not just implementing technology, creating new technology.
Yeah. I think there are a couple things, and just to pick up on what Mick said. The State Department has started a new section in energy and international energy, which is great. I always thought we should have energy as diplomacy. And I also think that what the U.S. focuses on are system-level thinking and systems where they could be broken down into components and subcomponents. So you may source panels all over the world, you may source other components, but if we could be the integrator and build modules that then could be, put in to help other countries develop a clean energy economy, I think that would be very important. I also think studying how you do microgrid and mini-grid so that all these panels that are being put in now in countries aren't going to be obsolete in 10 years and then they go backwards again. Because one of the things that in the last panel that were asked, what keeps you up at night, and I wished I had said, because it does, but I didn't, is just seeing how other countries as they're emerging, not to follow in our same evolution. I mean, Mick, you said it takes 100 years, 80 to 100 years to migrate from one energy source like wood to coal, coal to oil, now oil to renewables. It'd be nice if they could leapfrog that and go directly to more clean energy sources for the benefit of everyone.
I mean, there are plenty of examples in the communications economy, right, where people leapfrogged landline wires, copper wiring, and went to mobile, and they created a very dynamic communications infrastructure without nearly the cost and the investment required.
Right.
And there are often analogs if you want to do small-scale oil-fired generation in a remote place. The amount of money it costs you just to get the oil in there, and then the inefficiency of the combustion makes the electricity it produces costs roughly 10 times what our electricity costs. So all of a sudden, other technologies are more competitive. Now you have other challenges. In a remote area, maintenance is difficult. Right. Marketing is difficult. Helping people understand these opportunities are there. But there are different niches, and niches are critical for emerging technologies to grow and come down the cost curve. You brought up this question of how different countries approach renewable energy. And there's going to be a lot of competition, but it's critical to keep in mind that there are a lot of places where companies and innovators in different countries can build on each other. So in solar, we often produce ultra-pure silicon, high value-added product, make a lot of money, support good jobs, gets shipped it gets partly processed or shipped to China, gets turned through various stages into solar modules, relatively low value-added step in a lot of cases that will not support high-paying jobs, gets shipped back to the United States, where it supports high value-added installation jobs, where again, people can do well. So sometimes I worry that people want everything to be done in one country, and what we'll succeed in doing is making really expensive things that are all made here and that no one wants to buy, which isn't going to create a lot of jobs or drive a lot of transformation in our energy system. Right.
So Jeff, what's the pulse in Washington? I mean, what's the, because everyone comes from a very different background, public policy, private sector, but you all work with constituencies and very embedded and entrenched constituencies in Washington. What's the sort of the feeling generally on this topic?
I don't know. If I were a doctor, I'm afraid I would declare the patient dead. But no, to be serious. Things are evolving there, and there's a very unique dynamic going on in the Congress right now, and there's, sort of a civil war that's brewing in the House, and it'll be very interesting to see how that all plays out. I'm not a political commentator, so I won't go into that any deeper, but as far as, how all of this applies to renewable policy going forward, again, it's really hard to make any prognostication here. We have a lot of important policies and incentives for renewables that are nearing expiration or that have already expired, and it's going to be important to continue those if renewables are continue to grow as strongly as they have for the past few years. I'll make one note about what role utilities are playing in the traditional utility business model in the United States. So renewables are growing very quickly in some areas of the country and not so quickly in others. In some regions, photovoltaics, for example, where customers install them on their own roofs, they're growing so quickly that the traditional utility business model is under threat or potentially under threat, especially if they continue to grow. And this is occurring because a traditional utility has to serve all the customers in its rate base, in its area of coverage, and it has to do so with a certain set of revenue streams that come in every year. And as more and more PV is installed, they're selling less and less electricity out there. So in order to recover that same amount of revenue, they have to raise the price for every unit that they sell. And every time they raise the price, then more and more people say, I'm not going to pay this, I'm going to just install PV on my roof because it's going down so much. And so you've got this vicious cycle going on that really is going to have to be addressed, because this is, in some areas of the country, this is a serious policy question that needs to be thought about more. Because it's,
what part of the country is actually sort of?
Well, California especially, where you have leasing. You don't, if you want to install PV on your roof in California and many other places as well, including Colorado, you don't have to put any money down to do so. You can just lease the cells, and a company will come and install them on your roof. They'll put 4 or 5 kilowatts on your roof and say, okay, from now on you have to pay $50 a month to pay back this PV we installed on your roof, and we'll settle up whatever the balance is through net metering, and that's how it goes. And people are beginning to do that in pretty large quantities now.
No, go ahead. All right, after you. So just in terms of one development in renewables, which I would be remiss if I didn't state it, there is a bill that was put forward in the House by Congresswoman DeGette from Colorado, and also Rogers. So it's the DeGette-Rogers bill on hydropower, and I think it's probably the only bill that got a unanimous passing. It certainly is probably the only renewable bill. So this is on hydropower and how to streamline the permitting and the licensing of hydropower, because there are 80,000 dams in the US and only 3,000 produce electricity. So you have 77,000 dams that are there, flood control, navigation, reservoir recreation, water storage, that could be powered and probably produce enough electricity to power 20 to 30 million homes. So this is a significant resource that we need to get after, but it takes too long to license, permit, and build, so that it's not very attractive to the financial community. So if we can get the MLP legislation through, and we can get through these bills, there's a similar bill, Word bill, going through the Senate, then there's a possibility to unleash a renewable that Republicans and Democrats love.
Right.
I was just going to come back quickly to the politics question that you asked. I think it's interesting if you reflect. American energy politics, like a lot of American politics, goes in cycles. Now, how many of you remember, in this room, remember 2008 when John McCain and Barack Obama fought over whose cap and trade program was better? That's ancient history at this point. But we've been through this kind of cycle before. The last time we had really intense national energy fights was in the aftermath of the first oil crisis in 1973. And for the first few years, we actually managed to move forward on multiple fronts without getting stuck in big fights. We approved a big pipeline in Alaska. We had the first ever fuel economy rules for cars and trucks. We put money into clean energy innovation. And then by the end of the decade, it was all about crushing the other side and making sure yours won, the soft path and the hard path. And we didn't get very far. By the end of the 1980s, lower oil production, clean energy starved of funds, no new rules for fuel economy. We're going backwards on every front. And we're going through, I worry we're going through the cycle again. We've had these big advances across the board, and at first people were embracing them, and now they're trying to knock the other down. Right. We've got these opportunities. We would all be better off if we looked a little bit more about how our favorite sources could gain from a slightly more cooperative strategy, and a little less about making sure that the ones that we really hate lose.
Yeah. I mean, what are the forces that are pushing against clean energy for whatever reason, if you feel comfortable saying?
Wow, it's just so different of a perspective. Okay. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah, one interesting way to look at it is the approach that China takes versus the approach the United States takes. Most of our policy in the United States related to clean energy has to do with tax credits. That's our policy for incentivizing renewables. In China, they say, no, we're going to have an industrial policy, and we're going to pick, we're going to pick winners, basically, and we're going to make it easy for companies to make massive investments to produce PV or wind turbines or things like that. It's really a big cultural difference between how we approach addressing clean energy deployment.
I think other countries are doing what the U.S. used to do in terms of they're taking 25-year, 50-year approaches to solving problems. And to Kristina's, just building on that point on hydropower, once it's in place, it can last for hundreds of years. A biofuels plant is not going to last 100 years. But the problem is all the policies and procedures to get it in place, no one invests because they're not taking a 100-year perspective and time frame. And to your point earlier where you said other countries, you're seeing the research and go up. Companies that are coming to Harvard to do work with researchers at Harvard, they have 10, 15, 20-year timelines. Most of the US companies that are coming are, what technology can I have that I can turn around in 2 or 3 years? And until we, as a society, take that longer viewpoint, I don't think we will fund renewables.
So I think it's useful to think about two kinds of opposition. One is from people who either, for an abstract reason, don't want to see clean energy succeed, or from people who think that it is a threat to their own business. And that's the one we tend to talk about. I think there's a second category that's at least as interesting and important, and it comes from people who don't like the kinds of tools that we use to encourage clean energy development. So our fights over clean energy become proxies for much bigger ideological fights about the role of government in society. And so you don't say, I hate Solyndra because you hate Solyndra. You say, I hate Solyndra because you want to say that government should not be in the business of picking particular companies. So some of this is going to be irreducible. Some of it we should be able to get around by taking broad-based policies that create a level playing field for clean energy and allow the market to operate. And some of it, again, I think is a turning of this cycle where we move back to thinking about our energy problems mostly as energy problems and less as ways to send signals to our constituents about how we feel about the world at large.
I was at an interesting event last week in London. It was the president of the World Bank, Jim Kim, was speaking about clean energy, and his basic point was, because remember, he doesn't have a government, right? He has a sort of governmental institution, global, institution that he manages, and he basically said, look, to me, it's about young people. It's about influencing young people because there needs to be a movement, and. Quite honest, I think his point had relevance because it's a different generation that's going to wake up and say it's my future, it's right. My next 100 years that I'm going to live through. So and he just sort of felt that once that movement sort of takes hold, it is one of those things that can rapidly change. And it's funny because we come from a certain generation. We're talking about things because we remember the 70s, the oil shock and what that meant, and it's we're unwinding our own thoughts about what could happen with climate change. Whereas, I think a lot of people today wake up, and a lot of a younger generation wakes up and says, it's here, it's now, and there are things that we can be doing to fundamentally change how we live. And it's not about tax credits, and it's not about if I'm paying 5 cents more or 10 cents more for my electrical bill. It's about the kind of planet I want to live in. And I just thought he just had a really fresh perspective on things that was really kind of nice to see. So. All right, we have some time to think about the future. And I hate to put you on the spot and you have to bring out your crystal ball and say, all right, if we really don't do anything now on clean energy, it just sort of stays static, we still kind of do the fracking and the oil, and we don't really change the fundamental dynamics of clean energy, what do you think the planet looks like? How scared should we be, if we should be?
You should be scared. Look, we're bad at predicting the future. The planet is an extraordinarily complicated system. Our energy system is extraordinarily complicated, so even if you say, well, how will it evolve without new policy, it's hard for me to predict. But if you look at the basic trends we're facing in the energy world, and then you say, how will this burden the atmosphere with carbon dioxide? And then you look at the range of models and their predictions, yes, some of them will say we'll have relatively limited warming. And some of them will say we will have 5, 6, 7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Not Fahrenheit, by the way, Celsius.
Yeah, right.
That's a heck of a lot of warming. And you want to tell me what that's going to mean for ecosystems, for weather, for human responses, for coasts?
People living.
Again, to me, it's not about predicting the future and how bad we know it will be. It's about mitigating risk. And we do this all the time. I spent the first part of my career in the national security world, and part of what I did was work on nuclear terrorism. In nuclear terrorism, no one says there probably won't be a nuclear terrorist attack, so let's lay off and not do much about this. They say, if there were one, it would be devastating. So let's spend some money and buy some insurance, we know how to do it, and reduce those risks. And I wish we had a bit more of that mentality in the energy space. Yes, it's a commercial space, it's different from defense, and you have to figure out how the public and private pieces work together. But there are some elements in common that are really important.
If we look right now, we spent, several hundred billion responding to disasters that happened just this last year, whether it's Hurricane Sandy or any of the other fires and flooding and hurricanes. So we're already spending hundreds of billions of dollars on that. We're already spending $600 billion a year on healthcare costs. So we're underwriting the policies to help, pay for the premiums for people that develop emphysema and asthma from toxins being in the atmosphere. So I think that it's happening right now. But it's a little bit of, I think, a frog in the water, boiling water.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say that if you want to put climate change and everything aside and just say, I'm not even going to worry about that, just the pure economic or engineering analysis is going to tell you if you just stick with the conventional sources, you won't have enough energy to sustain the human population. Forget the climate can stay the same. Oil's run out how many times? And we keep finding new sources of oil and new sources of natural gas. But if you don't start adding renewables, ultimately you're not going to be able to sustain the population just from a pure numbers game, even if the climate stayed the same. So you need to look at different options.
I don't think I have anything else to add other than it's extremely urgent to begin action.
All right. Well, look, in the time that we have, we'd love to open up to questions from the audience.
Kristina, to hit your goals that you talked about, what do we have to do to get renewables and/or natural gas into the transportation system? And what kind of penetrations do we need to do,
Right.
et cetera?
Right, so I think that, I thought you were going to ask a different question, so I'm going to answer that one, which is very similar to yours. Which is, if we don't do anything, what will business as usual get us to? So most of the European automobile manufacturers say that by 2020, every new car will be either a hybrid or an EV. It'll have the option. So I think that's a pretty interesting prediction, because if you look in this country, if we keep our cars for every, I think, 15 years, and I've seen numbers between 11 and 15 years, then half of our fleet by 2030 would be somehow a hybrid car. So I think you'll see transportation go pretty far, even if we don't do much, because of the push, it's already on that way. But all of us have to decide that we're going to buy that kind of vehicle, right? So I think that's one thing. In terms of the renewables, so we did a pretty detailed plan on how much renewables and how much hydro we'd have to do by 2030, and actually how much nuclear. So as it turns out, it's about 5,000 megawatts of wind a year. I think last year we did 9,000 megawatts or more. 13,000. 13,000, so it was 2 years ago, it was 9,000. So we're already doing, I mean, if we could continue even at half the pace we're going now, but that requires some policy, we'll get there. Solar, we'd have to do about 4,000 megawatts a year. We're not doing that quite yet, but I think we're doing, what, a couple thousand? Hydro, we'd have to either upgrade or power about 20,000 to 24,000 megawatts. To give you an idea, we've got about 100,000 megawatts in the US. 77,000 would be what's called traditional, and about 30,000 would be pumped storage. So, you know, that's less than 50% of what we currently have now. And in terms of nuclear, in order to get to the 80% clean non-carbon electricity by 2035, we'd have to build 52 Generation 3+ nuclear power plants over the next 20 years. Which, by the way, in the heyday of the nuclear power industry, we built 13 a year. So none of this is a difficult technology lift. It's a policy, it's a financing, and it's a collective will.
So let me pick up briefly on this question of, you asked about different technologies for vehicles. And one of the ways to think about it is that different kinds of vehicles might be better suited to different kinds of technologies. So for passenger vehicles, improvements in conventional combustion and gains in electrification, to me, seem to be the most interesting, aside from some niches. When you go to larger scales, to long-distance trucking, to fleet vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, it's tougher to see electrification as being the big player. And then you start to ask about natural gas, either compressed or liquefied, and about biofuels. Right. And I'm not a great predictor of the future, but I think we need policies that either regulate fuel economy for those kinds of vehicles in ways that create incentives for alternatives to come in early, or that make them pay the full consequences of oil consumption for climate, for national security, for the economy, so that these other sources can compete more effectively. I know Mick knows a lot more about biofuels than I do, maybe can speak to that. I know that in the gas side, we're starting to see a lot of experimentation with liquefied natural gas coming to long-distance trucking, solving some of the chicken and egg problems that have bedeviled a lot of alternative technologies, because you have more market concentration and because you have some really highly trafficked routes where you can actually build out the vehicles and the infrastructure at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, those are all good points. Just from a trucking perspective, you could get to 100% ethanol or 85% ethanol for the trucking fleet. The technology's there. And to Kristina's point as well, it's just a matter of will, financing, and who's going to do it. The technology's not going to be the issue, really.
I want to share one story. In the mid-90s, I used to live in the former Soviet Union, the Southern Caucasus. And this is right when the Soviet Union fell apart, and the whole, like, the transportation infrastructure, trade infrastructure just went bananas. And so in the Southern Caucasus, I lived in a country where the supply chain for gasoline was extraordinarily expensive, and the borders were closed. And within a span of about a year, everyone changed their cars to natural gas. I mean, literally, it would cost like $400 to change a little Fiat to a natural gas system. And now they put it along. But the point is, the whole country changed, and all of a sudden, the economy got started again. And then you realize, it's not like you're saying, it's not that big a challenge. If you really have to change, you change. And they built those natural gas filling stations. But I was surprised how inexpensive it was and how fundamentally easy it is to change this kind of gas tank to that kind of tank. and there you go. And then you're off. And it's not that complicated.
And we put barbecue grill tanks in
Yeah, exactly. In the former Soviet Union, you'd see anything. Yeah, yeah.
No, we hear that energy transitions must take 80 years because wood to coal took roughly that long, and coal to oil took roughly that long, and that's not a lot of data points. There are several scientists on this stage who would say if you have like 2 or 3 data points, you cannot predict the future from that.
Yeah, I've seen it with my own eyes, but yeah.
Hello. I wonder if one of the biggest enemies of renewable energy today isn't the surplus of non-renewable energy, particularly in the United States, and the overhanging glut of dirty capacity, which did lead to a giant fall in the capacity market in PJM. It strikes me that in a market, to generalize, like the United States, where the demand for energy is growing perhaps at 1% a year across the board, the greatest sources of innovation will be in areas that aren't like that, the California, Texas markets, or markets where people figure out how to encourage creative destruction of the existing base, Germany, Japan, and nuclear. Or in this country, when cars are proven to be unsafe, they're recalled. If we have drugs that don't work out, they're banned by the FDA. We have an installed base of power plants, several hundred gigawatts, that are unsafe at any speed, so to speak. How do we encourage more of that creative destruction so that the demand side is a major driver of new hydro, or of new solar, or of new wind?
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see that with, in the president's speech with what the EPA has been working on to get new emission standards that will come out. I mean, I think one of the most extraordinarily great things that happened, and that Lisa Jackson, the EPA, pushed through a collaborative working with industry, was the 54 mile per gallon new CAFE standards coming in the mid, 25. I think that's brilliant, and that's the kind of thing I think you're referring to. So I would absolutely agree. The glut and having a lot of coal that is going to be retired in the future, I think will lay the foundation for spurring that kind of innovative capital investment.
One of the things that's interesting to think about is this interplay between technology development and regulation of the kind you're talking about. I think if we would have had a discussion 5 years ago about EPA regulation of existing power plants, coal-fired power plants, encouraging not just more efficient coal-fired power plants, but switching to different technologies, people would have been extremely nervous about that prospect. And they were very nervous. In the last few years, because of more abundant gas and because of falling costs for renewable energy technology, and by the way, we haven't talked about efficiency yet, lower cost opportunities to reduce the amount of energy that we use. It's a lot more feasible to see a set of rules that we can meet in a pretty clear way at a reasonable cost that delivers on a lot of our goals. And so there's that interplay between technology development and the policy world that goes back and forth that I think is actually starting to move in a good direction right now.
That's a very well-posed question, I thought. And it's interesting to observe over the past 4 or 5 years in the US power sector, we've had voluntary, market-driven, largely, switching from coal to natural gas on the order of 60 or 70,000 megawatts, okay? People are talking about these EPA rules coming out and having a similar impact, requiring 50 or 60,000 coal plants to retire. It's okay if the market does it, but once people talk about regulation having the same impact, then they become, they become vocally against it. So that's an interesting observation.
Could you all say a little more about energy efficiency? It seems to be missing from this conversation. If you look at a least cost path, clearly the energy efficiency investments can do a lot better than anything on the supply side, and yet it's been absent from the conversation except for just the last few minutes. And I wonder why that is. Why are we sort of focused so much on supply that we don't look at the bird in the hand, which is the energy efficiency? I mean, we've doubled energy efficiency or more in the last 30 or 40 years. We clearly have that potential again. And so would you speak to that?
So Roger, I would like to say that in our plan from the Undersecretary's office, it's a given. We want to go from 100 quads, which we use today. Business as usual would be out in 50, we'd be at 128 quads, but keep that flat. So we have to do that. So we have to continue, as you said, we double the energy efficiency. Going forward, we have to continue to decrease our energy use by, 1 or 2%, so that when out at 2050, we've reduced it by the equivalent of 30 quads. So I was remiss about not mentioning that. Good point.
So we talked early on about financial side innovation, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there when it applies to energy efficiency. Right? An economist will tell you that that if people are right, that there are all these negative cost opportunities to cut our emissions by being more efficient. It's like having $20 bills lying all over the ground. If they existed, someone would already have picked them up, so they don't exist. The reality is there are a lot of barriers to adopting these, and so when we find schemes where someone, other than, let's say, a homeowner, can put the money up front to install more efficient appliances or windows or whatnot and take some of the savings back, everyone makes gains and we get around some of these barriers. There are other pieces in the efficiency world where we actually need to have less regulatory barrier to adopting efficient solutions. I live in New York City. We are the Saudi Arabia of buildings leaking energy. If we could capture even half of that, we would be an enormous contributor to a better global energy balance. But if I wanted to make a big change to a building in New York, I would have to go through so many permitting processes and so many different applications that it would wipe out, in a lot of cases, the savings that I get from energy efficiency. So we need to think about how our existing regulatory infrastructure often gets in the way of doing cost-effective things that are good for the environment, good for our security, good for the economy.
Yeah, I guess I would say, notwithstanding Yahoo's policy of having everyone show up at work now, you could actually reduce your gasoline consumption 20% by having everyone stay home 1 day a week. And I've been in industry, academia, corporate, private, public. I can guarantee almost everyone's job 1 day a week you can do from home with internet connectivity, and you don't have to drive at all. So to your point, I think there is some low-hanging fruit, but it's going to be a policy and a personal way of life change that people have to get used to.
I think we have time for one more question.
Mike Pack, San Diego and Aspen. Just a quick question, and it just seems so obvious that you can start with baby steps and leading by example. The post office, why don't they use electric cars? I mean, they're out there every day, and it'd be an example that the federal government could spawn, as an encouragement that, hey, look what we're doing something.
That's a great point.
The post office might have a bit of a financial challenge these days. But the broader issue of government procurement is really important. You provide an early market that allows innovators to know that they have someone to sell to. The Department of Defense is really interesting that way, particularly in end-use efficiency. Someone did an estimate a few years back that said that once you get a gallon of gas to the front lines in Afghanistan, so you paid for the convoys, for the protection, it was $140 a gallon. So there's a huge incentive to efficiency when you're on the other end of that, and as you invest in it, you bring down costs for everyone else. So figuring out how to use government, I mean, you guys did a lot of that.
Yeah, so, use government buying power to buy power. And so there's a $6 billion solicitation on the street from the Army Corps of having basis source wind and solar. Ironically enough, it doesn't include hydro, but that's, we always get left out. So I think that's part of it. It turns out if we just upgraded and modernized the hydropower that the US government owns, we could green 50% of the electricity consumption of the US government. If we add another 7,000 megawatts, which is not a lot, we'd green the entire US government. Fantastic. So it comes back to permitting and licensing and that sort of thing. So.
Well, by way of close, I was wondering if very briefly, if the panel can lay out a call to action. If they said, look, if you all leave this building and do one thing in the interest of renewable clean energy, what might that be?
You're going to start with me.
Well,
well, I would say the first thing is that each of us can be a leader in what we do, and that comes from the little things when you do not want me to stay at your house, because if you do, your incandescent bulbs will be gone. Your plugs will not be plugged in, your toaster and all the other things. You will be walking most of the time, because I do not own a car. So I think all of us can take up the banner and do what we can do individually. And then many of you, if you're in a position where you're either on a board or you're in a place where you can actually buy power from renewable energy, right now it's been very difficult with the low gas prices. With the gas prices coming back, that's increased the power purchase agreement capability. But without that, we can't get them financed. We can't get them financed, we can't build them. And just as an example, I think one of the leaders of thinking about how planting trees can mitigate a carbon footprint is Roger Sant. And the plant we're building will be the same as planting 1 million trees. So I think that thinking about those sorts of activities that we can all do individually makes sense as well.
Maybe we'll jump to Jeff. The guy got you.
You weren't ready.
I know.
In sequential order. The only thing I'll say, I guess, is that if people really are interested in renewable energy, you know, the political dialogue is still important, and contacting your representatives and telling them how you feel is really important. The other thing is behavior, and I'm sure most people in this room pay attention to their energy use behavior, turning off lights, not taking unnecessary trips, things like that. It sounds very superficial to say that, but on a massive scale with 310 million people, it makes a difference.
That's great.
Okay, just echoing that in the sense of if you walk away not to do something, but forget about technology in the sense that there's enough people working on the technology in the US and the rest of the world, those problems are going to get solved in terms of how to harness solar, wind, geothermal. So if you're going to spend your time and effort, it should be on the behavior and the politics and getting the governments to cooperate or come up with a unique financing mechanism to get this done. But don't be so worried that the technology won't be there, because it definitely will.
All right, Mike, bring it home.
So I'm a policy guy, and I'm inclined to say, make sure your representatives back policy that change the incentives across the board, so that it's not just the people we're talking to in this room, but everyone in their day-to-day decisions that make small shifts that add up to something big. But there is something I think that's important in this room in particular. A lot of people have substantial investments, and the investment world is as much a place where we need first movers and early adopters as the technology world. And so there are people trying out new schemes for steering money into new kinds of energy technologies. And yeah, are they a bit riskier? Perhaps. Are there a bit more unknown out there because we haven't had a lot of them? Yeah, but if people take a bet on some of those, people might find out how to finance some of this transition in a way that pays off with a whole host of different technologies.
Terrific. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.